So you didn't have many people, to compare yourself with, to be concerned about. The amount of news that was getting through was relatively small. But in the last,
So what we're going to do now is I'm actually going to introduce who this lovely person is. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I certainly can.
You can.
So I'm Dan Farmer from Anxious to Zen-ish.
Yeah.
And my business teaches the employees of companies how to develop something called psychological flexibility, which most other people know as resilience. Resilience to the inevitability of life's events. Things happen.
Life's challenges, which
Life's
are
challenges, absolutely.
these days in abundance, and it doesn't always come from one direction, which can be a massive complication for people because it comes from every angle.
Yeah, myriad of sources these days, because we're not, go back, only say 100 years or so, people were, tended to live in quite small communities, relatively speaking, unless you were in a very large city. So you didn't have many people, to compare yourself with, to be concerned about. The amount of news that was getting through was relatively small. But in the last, it's got to be 20 odd years or so, 20 plus years, the rise of 24-hour news, the increase in social media platforms, things like YouTube really coming on stream, which I know this is actually being promoted on to some extent.
Yeah.
But it gives us the ability not only to be concerned about the future. Social media allows us to compare ourselves to beautiful and talented people all over the world, and to start having the inevitable thoughts of, why aren't I good enough? Why don't I meet up or match up rather to, those perfection expectations that seem to be, riddled throughout society. And it's no coincidence that a local government report, I can't remember exactly which year it was, can't remember off the top of my head, but it did state that mental health amongst all age groups has been deteriorating over the last 20 years, especially in children. And children are the ones who've been most exposed to this technological increase, which has thrown a lot more information at us. But at the same time, they've got very plastic brains. Their brains are still developing. Us older stages, our brains are not as plastic. We can't learn things as fast as we could when we were kids. That's just part of our growth cycle. So we are feeding children a huge amount of information, some of which is processed by this amazing prefrontal cortex up here and is perceived in a particular way, because whatever we take in, we put our own judgments on. Effectively, we perceive it in a particular way. And as a general rule, as we've certainly talked about before, as human beings, we tend to be negatively biased because that keeps us safe. So we see something, we see it from a negative perspective. We often struggle with our mental health as a consequence of that. And we're seeing this laid bare in a lot of the research that's being done at the moment. And, whilst it's not conclusive as to what's causing it, I think there's some very well-educated guesses as to what has been causing that rise in mental health. And certainly, you talk about what's gone on with COVID over the last few years, cost of living crisis, and various other things of that that nature, all contributes. And there's probably no one single thing that people can point to and say that's what's causing it. But I would argue that the amount of information that's being poured into this melon between our ears is certainly not helping the situation in any way, shape or form. And people need to learn where the brakes are of this thing, so they don't get caught up in the thinking. They're able to stop themselves before they go down that route of worry and catastrophization and what we call anxiety, which is future orientated fear, essentially. What's going to happen in the future?